welcome to the 25th episode of the History Talks. This episode is our final episode in our series on the communist revolutions of the 20th century, and is our final episode of the year 2020. So we started this show in January 2020. Now here we are in December 2020, filming our 25th episode. And so we'll start out the new year of 2021 with another series on the fall of the Roman Republic. But today, we're going to go ahead and finish up our series on the communist revolutions of the 20th century by discussing the fall of the Soviet Union. So Sebastian, what led to the fall of the Soviet Union?
Our story starts in the 80s. The Soviets had been on the decline for some time. In the 60s, they had seemed almost victorious. You know, in the 60s, they were the first people in space. They had accomplished all this stuff. But by the 70s, they weren't accomplishing anything. And by the 80s, the cracks were beginning to show. The Soviet economy had been centrally planned for the longest time. While there was some semblance of private property, all industries were planned by Moscow, or...
Let me just stop you there for a second. When you said in the 1980s, the cracks were starting to show, these are cracks that were laid in previous decades and had been building up, and you're saying they're starting to show. So it wasn't that any significant changes were made in the 1980s that caused these cracks. It's just that the system was built on so many flaws that the flaws just couldn't be covered anymore.
Yes, and the biggest and most outstanding of these flaws being the fact that almost everything was centrally planned, down to taxis.
Down to taxis? Wow, okay. Yeah. So the taxi service, if they needed to make a change to a local taxi service, they had to go through some sort of central agency.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this caused a lot of inefficiencies. I remember one man joked that if you wanted if you needed a plumber, you would go to the agency, you would request a plumber, and you would wait 20 years.
20 years.
Obviously, a bit of an exaggeration, but I think it gets the point across.
Yeah, and they didn't have YouTube then. Right now, if I need to do some plumbing, I just go on YouTube and watch an expert in plumbing fix something, and then I learn how to fix it myself.
Yeah.
So that would have been interesting if they had that then, but that did not exist in the 1980s.
Yeah. Those some communities had tried to form some semblance of their own economy. By and large, the USSR was not doing well, and though Moscow, you know, if you look at a photograph of Moscow, it looks nice. The Soviets, statistically, their economy was on the decline, especially when compared with the Western nations.
I see. Okay, so there still may have been some nice parts to it, but the majority of the Soviet Union was struggling. It was having problems, and then not only that,
but their larger economy especially.
Yeah, their larger economy. Yeah, their economy as a whole. But I was going to say it's not just them. There's an actual international set of states or of countries that are reliant on them, like we did earlier in this series on communism in the 20th century. We talked about Cuba, for example. Cuba was reliant on Soviet aid. The Chinese the Chinese went back and forth, but there are various other countries in Asia that were funded by Soviet aid, other communist countries. So it's not so the impact of the Soviet Union struggling itself.
Yeah.
Not only impacts the Soviet Union, not only impacts the Eastern Bloc countries, but impacts countries around the world.
Yeah. Eventually, expenses need to be cut, mainly for foreign aid to farther away communist countries. And as the Soviet Union goes on, it eventually becomes clear to the Kremlin that something needs to be changed. Enter Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev recognized the flaws of the Soviet Union, whereas...
So Mikhail Gorbachev becomes the leader.
Yeah.
He's the Communist Party leader. in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, he's the leader of the Soviet Union.
He is the head of state of the Soviet Union, and when
or the head of government.
Head of government. What year is this?
It's 80.
Okay, so sometime in the 1980s, we can look that up.
Yeah.
And by the way, if anybody's watching and you see me keep glancing to the side, we now have a large world map right over to my left here, so I may be glancing over there for various things while we speak. Okay, so Gorbachev becomes the head of the Soviet government, and what happens in the 1980s? What happens then?
Yeah. So he begins a reform program to try to overcome some of the flaws of the Soviet Union, because, of course, he's not the only one recognizing these flaws, but many others in government have been, trying to ignore these flaws, most notably the Politburo, who have been like, no, all the money is going to us, and that is fine. We can just keep doing this forever, or at least for the rest of our lives.
I like the accent, too. It's good.
So the Politburo, they're not too enthused about a reform program. They're mainly turning a blind eye to some of the problems because they're personally doing well.
Right.
So Gorbachev, he wants to introduce more of a market economy. There's less central planning and more planning down to earth, whether that mainly through the form of he wants to transfer the planning responsibilities from Moscow to the workers and decentralize the economy in the hopes that, the Soviet economy, because one of the major inefficiencies is, everything has to go back to the central agencies.
Right, which is incredible if you look at the landmass of the Soviet Union. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Our viewers can't see, but we've got this nice map. I'll put one up on the screen when we do the editing. But yeah, you've got this absolutely massive landmass, and you have it all in the very western, or the capital is in the very western area of this massive landmass. I mean, I think most of the population is in the western part of Russia too, right? Most of Russia is just barren and empty, but still, the fact that it has to be distributed so widely and all has to go through the central agency, I can see that would cause problems. So was Gorbachev, was he actually going for a market economy, or is it just simply he wanted to decentralize and have more local control?
He also wanted to introduce more market elements, not fully. He was looking at the transition to capitalism and thought it could be a good idea, but he wanted to, at least keep some of that communist element, at least in ways that he thought would be beneficial.
Right, he wasn't looking for a revolutionary change. He wanted some kind of incremental change to fill in the gaps. As you mentioned, there were cracks in the system that could no longer be hidden, and he wanted to try to do that. So where you may have, for example, a supply and demand differential that cannot be handled correctly from a central agency in Moscow, he thought maybe at the local level, if we give control back there, people can set supply and demand ratios in a better way there.
Exactly. He also lifted some of the price controls and looked into cooperating more with multinationals, not fully transitioning into, we're just going to have a bunch of multinationals, but it is under his rule that the first McDonald's opened in Russia.
Wow, the first McDonald's opened in Russia. So that was sometime in the 1980s. And what did the Russian people think of the McDonald's opening there?
They noticed that they felt like, okay, we're having positive change. We're starting to like this, but a large portion of people still recognize that it wasn't enough. They felt like it wasn't enough.
It was a symbolic gesture, but it wasn't going to correct a system that was fundamentally flawed.
And plus while some of these multinationals were appealing, most notably Pepsi. You may have heard about this some other place, but Pepsi worked well with the Russian government. To the point where, for a while, Pepsi became the favorite soda of the Russian people.
Okay.
Anyways, But Gorbachev's reforms were just that, reforms. And not only that, but some of their effectiveness was hindered by the Politburo, who wanted to keep a status quo that was funneling money to them.
I see. Okay.
And in addition to all these economic reforms, Gorbachev also started to do things like cut back on some of the laws restricting free speech. You know, allowing people to, allowing less restrictions on people speaking their mind.
Oh, so whereas before you may have been punished for criticizing your government officials, you now had, or he wanted to relax that a little, so you could actually openly criticize the government official. Maybe openly criticize a Politburo. I wonder if that was allowable or not, right? We essentially you have a country that's failing, the people are struggling, but you do have an elite class that says, well, you all may be struggling, but we're on top, so we don't want anything to change. We like this how it is. Let's keep it here. So could the average person then say, hey, we don't really like that? Could they now openly say that with his changes?
Or he was moving into that direction where, the police wouldn't punish you for just saying that.
Okay.
And additionally, he shut down the secret police system.
Oh, is that the KGB?
Or the KGB is the spy agency.
Spy agency, okay.
The part of the KGB that basically just acted like the CIA, that still existed, but, no more people getting taken away in dark suits for saying something behind closed doors.
Okay. Or at least maybe less of it.
Yeah. And however, people didn't just have a problem with the Politburo. They also had a problem with the system as a whole. And as the saying goes, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. People started more and more criticism came towards the government, and people started to. Now that their speech was less restricted, it was easier for people to organize, find people who also agree that X and Y changes need to be made. Okay. And this led to, people organizing for some sort of resistance. This wouldn't boil over for some time, but the groundwork was being set for greater revolutionary change.
Interesting.
And then
when is this? All in the mid-1980s? Is this happening?
This is later in the 80s.
Late 1980s. Okay.
So
late 1980s, there's unrest. Well, there was a lot of unrest to begin with, but restrictions on persecuting or punishing people for having opinions that may have gone against the ruling elite there, and were relaxed. Yeah. And this also allowed this opening up speech allowed people to organize, to form their own factions or coalitions to represent their interest.
Yeah. You obviously he would crack down if you would publicly try to form a militia, but non-violent organizations could theoretically be allowed in some cases.
Okay.
And then two things happen. First of all, two things happen. Chernobyl and the fall of the Berlin Wall. Let's talk about Chernobyl first, because this is what really... Because we already talked about fall of Berlin Wall in in that other episode, so let's talk about Chernobyl.
Okay.
Chernobyl was the explosion of this nuclear plant in the Ukraine that just killed a lot of people. It
was a nuclear meltdown.
Yeah, it was a meltdown. The area there is still, some of the air is still toxic to this day. So, as you can imagine, this was even more harmful to the reputation of the Soviet government and its economy. And Gorbachev tried to make a public statement about this, but his speech was not very well received. Some of his policies may have been helpful to the people, but his speech made him come across as, just another official. And with the policies, being viewed as not far enough, people were losing faith in Gorbachev as the one who would, help make things better.
You're saying the policies were not far enough. You're talking specific to Chernobyl or just policies in general were not enough to stave off the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Both of these things combined.
Okay.
The policies were not far enough, and Chernobyl arguably expedited the process of people, being mad at the government and at Gorbachev.
Right, because Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant, was run by the government.
Yeah.
And it was run ineffectively, and so ineffectively that it caused an absolutely massive amount of destruction during the meltdown.
Yeah.
Which, if you've ever looked into that, without going off on a complete tangent into Chernobyl, if you ever looked into that, there was a whole series of incompetencies and mistakes that led to that. That all could have been avoided had they had better procedures in place.
Yeah. So with all of this, people were getting madder and madder at the government. And then when the Eastern Bloc snapped, soon, because people in the Eastern Bloc were realizing, hey, we can break away, soon people in the USSR were getting these same ideas.
Right, so the Eastern Bloc, they're now seeing that the Soviet Union is struggling. It's, as you mentioned it, these cracks are really coming out at this point. The Soviet Union is really very tenuously held together, and the people in the Eastern Bloc know this, right?
Yeah.
It's not hidden. These cracks are not hidden any longer, and so the Eastern Bloc says, we don't need you.
Yeah.
See you later.
Yep, revolution after revolution in the Eastern Bloc. Word gets out to...
We're talking about the late 1980s at this point.
Yeah,
right?
we're talking about like 89, 1990.
Yeah, and then we get into like the fall of the Berlin Wall, which we talked about in a prior episode, was around this time.
Yeah, and in the Soviet Union, one thing especially fuels its flames: nationalism. Because remember, the modern day, because the Soviet Union's core territories was larger than, if you look at the borders of modern day Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for this is because the Soviet Union roughly just had the borders of the old Russian Empire.
Mm-hmm.
So they had, and that had a lot of groups that other than Russians.
Mm.
Especially in Central Asia, you had the Kazakhs, the Tajiks, the Kyrgyz, all these groups who had a very tenuous relationship with the Russians from the beginning, and with all these other problems coming to the forefront, this nationalism flared up. And this flared up in a lot of different parts of Russia, especially places like the Ukraine. And all of this led to not just a revolution in Moscow to, change the Soviet government, but people in all of these smaller SSRs trying to break away and form their own countries. And this is where the cascade really begins to, it really begins to start cascading, and eventually in 1992, the Politburo is disbanded and the Soviet Union is officially dissolved.
Wow.
In its place, several new republics, including Kazakhstan, the Republic of Belarus, the Republic of the Ukraine, and that's not even mentioning all the things that happened in the Baltic states.
And when this happens in 1982, Gorbachev is the one who signs whatever the document is stating that is the end of the Soviet Union. Is that correct?
Yes, but it's not entirely of his own free will, because remember, people are marching on Moscow at this time.
Right. That's true. I understand that. I'm not saying whether it was his free will or not. I'm saying he is the actual person who said, I am signing this, saying this is the end.
I think so.
Okay.
Whatever. Point is, in the core territory of Russia, in the actual in the territory that used to be the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic and also Karelia, the Russian Federation is formed, a new republic that's promises democratic elections with a parliament, a prime minister, and a president. I believe Boris Yeltsin is the first prime minister or president or whatever.
Yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah. And then after his term ends, a former KGB agent named Vladimir Putin gets elected. And this is where we go from the history of the Soviet Union to just the history of modern Russia. And because now we're getting into because Putin is elected in the 21st century.
All right, okay. And since this is the end of our series on communism in the 20th century, so when the Soviet Union officially disbanded in 1992, was that the end of communism in Russia or in the Eastern Bloc or in that region of the world, or did communism still exist there as at the end of the 20th century?
Ostensibly, communism had basically entirely lost power. You can still look at polls, and there are people who still identify as communists or whatever, and there's also in the former Eastern Bloc country of Moldavia, there's a tiny strip of land that's formed its own country called the Soviet Socialist Republic of Transnistria. That technically exists, and
but for the most part, it was no longer a communist system. It became a mixed economy.
Not even mixed. They decided to go the other way and invite full on capitalism. Not complete laissez-faire. They're not like libertarian or anything, but like.
But when this happened in 1992, people pushed back. They didn't make some kind of incremental change. They pushed back in the opposite direction of controls. Okay, economic controls. That's interesting. And where do they stand now?
They're a bit. Putin has been like putting a bit more restricted than when they first totally overthrew the government. It's not complete laissez-faire, but it is it is generally some sort of free market capitalist thing.
Interesting. Okay, so beginning of the 20th century, we started our series with the Bolsheviks taking power in Russia, and then we end our series with Mikhail Gorbachev signing the end of the Soviet Union in 1992, and then closing out with a significant pushback against communist policies, not only in Russia but in the Eastern Bloc. Although in Asia we still have some, many of the policies were still in place at the end of the 20th century. In Cuba, many of the communist policies were still in place. But in the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe, it did not last.
Yeah.
It came at the beginning of the 20th century and was gone by the end.
Yeah, and most of the countries that had broken away from the Soviet Union, no longer want to do anything with Russia. The only exceptions being Kazakhstan is technically in this one economic treaty alliance, and Belarus has recently been really close with Putin, but other than that, most of the countries, they don't want to associate with Russia. They don't want to deal with any of that.
All right.
Many of them attempting to align themselves with NATO.
Okay, well, I think that was a great series we did on the communist revolutions of the 20th century. Did you have any final words you wanted to say?
Even though it's gone, it clearly left its impact.
Yes, it did. All right, well, thank you all for tuning in. We hope you all have a great new year. We will see you all in 2021 when we begin our next topic on the History Talks about the Roman Republic. All right, correct? Right. Okay. All right, goodbye and Happy New Year. Are you going to sing the Russian national anthem during it? Okay, you ready?
We could play that at the end.